Hello, Sales Nation. I'm your host, Will Barron, as always, and welcome to another episode of the Salesman Podcast. This episode, we're talking data with Steve Richard on a slightly higher level, perhaps, and then we get into some of the more fundamentals and what we can physically do as sales reps to use it later on in the episode. But I start the show by asking Steve, is data for the sales professional or is it for leadership? Is it for us to make better decisions, to improve upon our own skill set, which is, transferable between the job you're in now and the job that you're doing in 10 years' time, which is important because you're investing into yourself? Or is data for sales leadership to give you targets, to whip you into shape, and it's all just used for them? And I'm getting selfish with this episode, and I'm getting selfish on behalf of you guys because data is talked about a lot in sales leadership, in sales enablement, perhaps in your sales training as well, but I don't think many of us use it to its full extent. And so me and Steve dive to the bottom of all this. He makes me look silly on a couple of occasions by flipping the interview around, asking me questions that in hindsight I think I answered okay. But yeah, you guys can be the judge of that, testing my sales knowledge. You can find out more about Steve over at execvision.io. You can find out everything we talk about, including Steve's Cull Camps and all that good stuff, over in the show notes over at salesman.red/113. Over the weekend, I mentioned our new Facebook group. People are jumping in there. I'm only going to be accepting people the end of this week, so we'll have a critical mass of people all join at once at that point. So apply to the group over at salesman.red/group. And I'll see you in there, and I'll see you on the other end of this interview with Steve. Steve, welcome to the Salesman Podcast.
Hey, Will. Thanks for having me.
You are more than welcome. So today we're going to talk about a couple of things. Primarily data, what we can learn from it, and what sales people as well can learn from that specifically. Clearly, there's a shift happening in sales at the moment. You will be way more knowledgeable and involved in all this than I am and probably could ever be with what you do. But there's this shift. Sales leadership now have the opportunity to leverage loads of data about their sales teams to potentially improve their performance. I think some people are getting lost in that, and you're going to add some insights to that to get people back on track today. But where I want to start is, if you're a salesperson listening to this show, you're already in the top, say, 10, 20% of the sales team, so you're not particularly struggling. You know your industry well, you know your customers. Is using data and collecting that data and leveraging it, is that going to help an individual salesperson perform better?
It depends. The classic consulting answer, but it does. It depends. In some cases, there's only so much you can optimize, and every human being has a point of enough. So for some top 10%, 20% sales professionals, it doesn't matter what else you do for them. They're optimized and they have hit their point of enough, and that's where they're going to hit their commission check at. And for other individuals, depending on the company situation, so let me give you a real example, territory alignment. You're seeing a whole host of new solutions coming out around predictive analytics on which salesperson to put in which territory to optimize the salesperson in that territory. Very cool, very spooky stuff at the same time. But if you think about it, if there's a way that you can get the right person in the right territory, and that can, even if they're top 10%, improve their performance by 20, 30%, yet further, you'd be crazy not to look into that.
Okay, so I know. Obviously, you've given the answer that depends there. How does someone listening to the show know whether they, as a salesperson, rather than leadership, which we'll come on to, but they, as a salesperson, should invest time into looking how data can help them? If you're in the top 10%, are you probably doing enough and you're doing it all right? And so is data better for troubleshooting problems? Or where would you start with this? I guess from a consultative perspective.
If a salesperson listening to this, the first thing I would look at is conversion rates through the funnel. Because you don't need to have sales leadership decide to buy some fancy software for that. So what you do is take a look at who are the people who are converting at the highest rates of leads to opportunities to pipeline to close. And certainly there are many gradients within that, Will. Mm-hmm. And if there are folks who are converting at particularly high rates at some juncture in the funnel, then you got to study what they do. You better learn what they do. We have one of our customers called 787 Networks. It's a control play out of Ontario. And they have their average close rates ballpark 19% on opportunities, which is pretty typical. And they have one person closing at 29%. And they literally have no idea why. The opportunity definition is the same. All the other variables and factors are the same. But for some reason, this person can convert 10% higher closing rate percentage than other people. So you got to start studying what those folks are doing and seeing if you can optimize that. And that's an easy thing you can do. As a salesperson, you would be crazy not to just pull up a chair and sit next to this person when they conducted one of their calls, listen to their call recordings later, do that kind of thing, study their email follow-up process and cadence and what they're doing. And again, you don't need any software to do that. There certainly is software out there that can assist all those different components, but you can do it just by asking, hey, do you mind if I see what you do?
Yeah, I'm intrigued here because this is something that I feel, and I never really did it as much as I should have as well when I was in outside sales in the medical device world. I did it a little bit in that I went out on days with reps who performed well, but what I'm getting at here is I never really found there's no methodology to it. And then halfway through the day, I'd forget the reason I was actually there, and I was just trying to help them sell and just chat and hang out with them anyway. Is there a process more than kind of how you described to go about this? So you mentioned call recording, which we'll obviously come on to a little bit later in the show. But do you need to record something and then study it afterwards? Can you do it in real time even?
It's better to do it in an asynchronous format as opposed to synchronous for exactly the reasons that you said before. Okay, and I'm going to use a metaphor here, a sports metaphor. So imagine if there is a soccer team / football team on the field, right? And in the moment, it's very difficult to receive coaching. The coach pulls the player to the sideline, yells at them for something that they did when they let someone pass them on the field or whatever it might be, and then coach throws that player back onto the field. In the heat of the game, it's difficult to separate the lessons from just being in the game. Like you said before, when you did the ride-alongs, what did you do? You started selling, right? You were in the moment versus in an asynchronous way. That's the game film room, right? That's when you have the opportunity to really sit back when there's no emotions, there's nothing heated, and study what's going on. So we've got one of our customers called Onsite, and they do this fascinating thing where they use a tool called Screencast-O-Matic for face-to-face appointments, and they can capture those recordings of face-to-face appointments, which is just genius. And then later on, we help them those recordings to analyze them and do some things. But there's a simple way you can do that is rather than you going and doing that ride-along for the day, go ask that person, hey, can you download this thing on your computer, just record, half a dozen of your face-to-face meetings, and then later on we'll take a look at them and understand what you're doing differently.
Okay, cool. So Screencast-O-Matic, tell us a little bit about Exec Vision, and then there's probably some other tools that you can tell us about as well to help optimize this process.
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, we'll talk about some of the other tools first, Will, because the last thing I want to do is make this promotional. But there is a category of software like the SalesLoft, Outreach, Yesware, ToutApp. All of those different applications are designed to measure the cadence by which, for the most part, email communication, but increasingly dialing communication. InsideSales.com obviously is one of these. That will allow you to measure the cadence and the effectiveness. So, for example, if you've got 10 sales professionals and they're all using that software, and one of them, their cadences are converting at much higher rates, so if there are 100 prospects on the table that they can go after, and they're getting 40 of those to convert to appointments, whereas everybody else is getting 10, we can very quickly and easily see what's going on and what the difference is there. So that's a really interesting category. Another really interesting category is, and going back to this territory alignment, pipeline and forecast accuracy improvement category, is players like TopOps, Pilotics, Viso, InsideSales.com just bought C9, all of these companies. And what they're all saying is, hey, look, we're going to remove the human error from your forecasts. Because everyone has error in certain amounts based on who they are, right? Mm-hmm. And we're going to optimize the salespeople in the territories, like I mentioned before. So there's a lot of really cool things happening in that category. Then another category to look at and to think about is what we're doing at Exec Vision, which is this whole, how do we take the conversation, which has historically been a black box in most sales organizations, right? Think about it. Marketing, they've got their marketing automation measurement easy to figure out. You can measure email pretty easily, but how do you measure conversations? That's crazy. We can do it now, right? So we can take those conversations, turn them into actionable data, actionable intelligence, and then reps can leverage that actionable intelligence to get better and listen and watch the game film, right? And watch selectively the parts of that. And by the way, we're not the only player in this space, but unlike the other vendors, I'm not going to go and list off a whole bunch for this one, right?
Well, and it's good that you didn't try and oversell that, and I appreciate that. The audience will as well. We'll link to everything that you mentioned then in the show notes over at salesman.red for this episode. And a question just came to me then, and I think this is going to be important, and for any sales management listening, this will be important for them as well. But to have this innovation in a sales team, to have the opportunity for any of these tools to do anything, there's obviously got to be the potential for an individual salesperson to experiment slightly with what they're doing. Should salespeople be experimenting, or should they blindly be following the process that's been put in place by sales management, sales leadership at their organization? And from my perspective, it's a slightly loaded question in that I've always experimented. I've always had great successes when I do that, but I've always been a pain in the arse to manage because of that. So obviously you hire people, you manage people, so you will have a different perspective on this perhaps than what I do as a on-the-foot salesperson with no management experience.
Okay, let me ask you one question, Will.
Okay.
Before I answer the question, I'm going to reverse it on you, okay? So when you were in that role, and I was like you, I would do my own experimentation. I don't really care what the bosses said.
Mm-hmm.
What do you see as being the downside of allowing sales reps to do their own experimentation?
The initial clear downside is that you could be wasting time, resources, which otherwise is to a relative extent proven in process to get results.
Awesome. Okay. So the answer for this one, of course, is it depends on your situation. Mm-hmm. It's almost always going to be the answer. And let me paint you two very different pictures. Okay. So you can understand. It's going to be a lot having to do with your culture of your organization, what you're selling, who you're selling to, the maturity of your company. All right. So let me paint you the picture of my little sales team of 3 here at Exec Vision, where we're very much in experimentation mode and given them in some leeway to experiment how they will, because where we are in this marketplace is we're still trying to figure out some basic things like ideal customer profile and personas and messaging and all these things. So we have some ideas, like for example, messaging. There are 3 or 4 different messages we're playing with. One is, and this is appropriate for the show, we call Exec Vision a podcast for your sales team, because we can take your call recordings and put them on a cell phone, much like a podcast, right? Another one is the whole game film metaphor that we've talked about. Another message is the conversation cloud. Take your conversations, put them in the cloud, and use them. We don't know which of those 3 messages plays best for which persona. We're not there yet, so you have to experiment. So that's my first example. Now, the second example, and I'm going to use a friend of mine in Atlanta named Dharmesh Shah at Earthlink, is a very, very different type of thing. Earthlink, much more established company, selling to existing customers, selling new offerings to existing customers. Very, very rapid growth and rapid scale in that organization, where they're going to have, before the blink of an eye, go from 0 to 100 inside sales professionals, right? And that type of an environment, you have to control that. So he's very much into experimentation, controlled experimentation at scale. The idea of letting 100 different people and giving them enough rope, they will absolutely hang themselves in that story compared to this story over here, and you can get in trouble real fast. So does that illustrate a couple different stories?
That does, and I want to throw another variable in there as well to get your thought on it. And I hate the term social selling, but it's relevant here for what it encompasses as opposed to the process itself. But do you not feel that with sales and the industry and our roles and how people want to communicate and the changing of the buyer's research, And this has all happened gradually, I feel, up until this point, and a lot of companies have responded, but now it's almost crisis point for a lot of bigger organizations that have been slower to latch onto a couple of these things. Do you not feel that the sales is moving fast enough at the moment that even if you are in a big company that is prioritizing repeatability and scalability, that there still needs to be that experimentation there as well? And I'm just playing devil's advocate with you here, Steve.
Oh, to be real clear, I do believe that those people need to experiment, and so does the VP of Inside Sales, Dharmesh Shah. The way he's going to approach that is he's going to use an application like I mentioned those before, the Sales Loft, Outreach, Tout App, yes, we're one of those, which have cadences built into them. And he's going to be very prescriptive with what those cadences are going to look like for those 100 salespeople, which, by the way, include social touches in addition to email and dialing, right? So as a result of him being able to have controlled experimentation. So think of it this way. You know the story of Thomas Edison, right? Thomas Edison, his whole thing wasn't take a bunch of inventors and stick them in a laboratory in Florida and see what comes out. You know, his whole thing was take a bunch of inventors and have a systematic process through which we iterate and innovate, right? And we do it as a group at scale. And that's what I'm talking about is doing that. And this is where Dharmesh Shah will certainly have people who will say to him, you know, one of his reps raise their hand and say, why are we doing this social touch here in our cadence? We should be doing our social touch here in our cadence, right? And then he'll go, that's a very good point. Why don't we test that? And then they're going to run a test and they're going to do an A/B, and then they're going to realize this kid was right. And oh, by the way, we just improved our conversion rates by 2.5%, which across a team of 100, we're talking some real dollars at that point, right?
And what percentage of sales do you think is science? What percent do you think is interpersonal? This massively depends. What percentage do you think is interpersonal skills, relationship building skills, as opposed to, and it's more difficult to collect data on that kind of thing, I guess, but what percentage would you put science versus art?
Okay, I'm going to give you a tough answer on this one because I'm very heavily science oriented. Because when push comes to shove, even the conversations, there's a science to the conversations. You know, the sales training industry is formed on the science of conversations. You know, our friends at Foresight BP and Miller Hyman and Value Selling and Sandler and so many have science and have observation at the core of what they do. Even going back to Neil Rackeman's spin selling, the Challenger sale, you know, there was real observation on how are buyers and sellers interacting and what are those things that we can learn from that. Now, those were all based on observation. It was based on researchers observing and then using like tick sheets to figure out which behaviors correlate with high sales performance. What I'm saying for the future is just like we have science applied to our cadence or our emails and marketing, we can also have science applied to the conversation itself. Because if we can measure, for example, let me give you a what if. Go to any salesperson or sales manager in the world, Will, and ask them, what should you be doing in your sales calls? Let me ask you, at a fundamental level, when you have a sales call, what's the thing that you want your sales reps doing?
From a salesperson perspective, I would hesitantly suggest you want to move them the next step of the sales cycle.
There's a great one. Okay, so if I ask, this is like the Family Feud, right, which is a game show in the U.S. But if I ask this question of 100 sales leaders on the board of the top 5 answers, you know, what's the thing you want your sales reps doing? You're going to hear closing for next steps, right, and scheduling a next meeting. You're going to hear not using filler words like like, kinda, sorta, you know. It just decredentials you. You're going to hear asking questions, and particularly what kind of questions, Will?
Open questions, consultative questions.
You got it.
I feel the pressure on here, Steve.
I'm flipping this around, right? We're having some fun. Asking open-ended questions. But and you're going to go find a sales trainer in the world that's not going to tell you to ask open-ended questions.
Sure.
But here's what we're going to find out. Because of where speech to text is right now, in the next 2 years, we're going to be able to answer very big questions like, does asking questions in sales really matter? what is the optimized time for one party talking versus the other party? Conventional wisdom would say, historically, conventional wisdom would have said, get the buyer talking 80% of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Corporate executive board challenger sale came around and said, no, not so fast. You don't want an interview. Instead, it's more like 50-50. But we don't have the answers to those questions because the conversation is still a black box. Do filler words really matter? Here's another example. We have one of our top people here in our appointment setting business, and she's got a mega problem. But she also makes the club trip and goes to Mexico every 6 months because she's one of our top performers. So we don't really know answers to these big, vexing questions and in how to conduct a sales conversation. So I know this is a long answer to a short question, but it's important. I believe in the future we will finally be able to answer that with real data because we can get the conversations transcribed. We can do an analysis of those conversations that are transcribed, and we'll know for sure what are those things that are really important. Here's another one that's kind of cool, is words per minute. So people have done an analysis of public speakers like TED Talks. So anybody who does a TED Talk, what's the optimal number of words per minute? And do you know what the answer is?
I have no idea.
I figured you wouldn't. It's about 120 to 130. They call that the Goldilocks zone, right? What's the optimal words per minute in a buying and selling dialogue? Right now, we have no idea. And
okay, let me
tend to talk too fast, right? Like I do.
Let me stop you there and let me interrupt because I'm intrigued now so in 2 years' time, we'll have some of these insights. Obviously, it takes time to then implement them, test the hypothesis and get results. That's, more years. In 5 years' time, Steve, do you see most salespeople working from a script and some of the life and energy perhaps is taken out of it? And then it could throw it all back on its head of then people don't like that. So they want an actual real conversation. So then that goes out the window, needs more testing. Does this just never end? Or is there going to be a point where for a period of time, a sales organization will have a script which works the best that it's going to work for most people?
Okay, definitive. No, there will never be a point in time in the future when it just comes down to reading a script in sales like you get from call centers.
Why not? Okay? If we can test everything and if we can come up with the perfect words per minute, the perfect language to be used, the perfect customer avatar that we're speaking to, so we're speaking to the right decision maker and all that, why can't we just use a script which, and not as simple as a script, something that branches off, for example, and goes all different kind of routes? But why isn't that the answer and the Holy Grail that we're all looking for?
Because life doesn't work that way. Life is improv, and sales fundamentally, and my friend Chris Beal at Connect and Sell, we talk about this all the time, and Trish Patuzzi, is sales is all about conversations. There's no such thing as a sale without a conversation. So there will be certainly, I'm going to think of this as, Kyle Porter coined this term, I think, bumper guards, like at a bowling alley, where you have, the bumper guards to make sure that you don't deviate too far off course, but there will absolutely be art within that. And I'll give you a real example. My friend, his name is Mike Peachy. He's the VP of sales at HubSpot Sales Solutions. So the HubSpot Sales Solutions team. And one of the things he's passionate about is telling stories in sales calls. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now there's a science to telling a story, as you I'm sure know, Will, because of the business you're in. There is a story arc, right? Star Wars is so beloved because it follows the story arc so closely. Here's an ordinary person who has something extraordinary happen to them. They find a mentor. They encounter terrible challenges, and then they prevail at the end. That's the story arc. You go to any writer in Hollywood, they know how this works. The story arc is a science. But you go to Mike Peachy at HubSpot, and you tell them, how do your sales reps on the ground tell those stories? And some of them tell those stories a heck of a lot better than others. And that's where the art form comes in. So to go back to the answer to your question, I see it being like 80% science, 90% science, but it will always be 10 or 20% art. And it will always require outstanding individuals who study their craft, who perfect what they do, and also who can't be replicated. I know we talked a lot about how do you clone or replicate top performers on this. There are some things that top performers do. We had someone here named Sarah Frick. We still can't replicate what she did, right? Even though we have all of our old recordings and old emails and stuff, they just don't work the same way for our people as they did for her. So that's the 10% art formula.
Amazing stuff. Okay, Steve, I've got a couple of questions I ask everyone that comes on the show. You've been through a couple of these before. I'm not sure if you're going to remember your old answers, so you'll have some new insights here, most likely. First one, who is the world's greatest salesperson? And why is that? Go a bit deeper with that, because he's been mentioned almost every episode I've recorded for the past couple of weeks. It's a weird thing to watch from the UK looking outside in, and I guess said it best recently in that he's just disrupting politics. He's just putting people. And again, I don't know too much about it all. I like watching the highlights of the debate, so I'm only seeing one side of it, probably from a skewed angle from whoever has produced the highlights of the debate. But he's disrupting it in almost every clip I've seen. He's competing essentially against people who went to a Ivy League school, had family in politics, then went into politics, then gone up through the ranks, and they've no real life experience. So when they criticize something about Donald, for example, someone was criticizing the fact that he'd hired, I don't know the fact, someone from Poland and he'd been sued for it or something like that. His rebuttal was, well, I've hired over 10,000 people. And so there's going to be things that, and my teams have as well. And I've managed all these people. You've done nothing. And so it just put the guy on his ass. And it was just a really intriguing thing to watch, because if Donald Trump succeeds or, gets anywhere close, I think that's going to have knock-on effects for elsewhere, especially in the UK, because we follow behind the US on a lot of these fronts. So yeah, why is he being so successful?
And I actually know the answer to this, because there was a fascinating article where they analyzed how he talks and how he communicates at a third grade level. Mm-hmm. And if you ever read a transcript of what he says, it's like garbly-gook. It doesn't make any sense at all if he's directly quoted. It doesn't. You're like, huh? But the reality is, if you can communicate and win people's hearts and minds on a third grade level, you're going to get in. And he's communicating around the two motivators of people, which everyone in sales should know. People are motivated to find pleasure and avoid pain. He is playing off of people's fears like crazy, and it's working.
Simple
and by the way, just to be real clear, like I'm not like I could not be any more neutral on this stuff. I'm like Switzerland. I'm more of like an interested. I almost feel like I'm you, Will. I'm like an interested third party, but I gotta say, he can definitely come across as being a big jerk, and I just don't want the president to be a jerk,
Well, he's being a real person, though. I don't know.
Yes.
I not Donald Trump specifically, and I've got no real investment in it all, but I'd rather someone who's running the country who has to make these crazy decisions, and we assume he actually has to, or he or she has to make crazy decisions, and doesn't just get into the White House, has a sit down and says, this is what's going to happen. Now you're just the face of it all. Not from a conspiracy theory perspective, but from a perspective of, this is the status quo. If you break this, industry is going to come at you. This happened. So assuming that they have the power that we assume they have, you want a real person in there, surely, rather than this face that is just doing everything just to get in the position in the first place, then to secure the next term, and then to just retire and go around the world doing speeches and making a boatload of money.
It'll be interesting to see. I'll tell you what, from the article I read and from the debates that I've seen and those kinds of things, I've written down some questions that we ask in our sales process that are intended to be like at a third grade level like that really play into exposing peers, to be honest. And I'll give you one of them. I have written down that here. What do you not know about your business that you need to know? It's a simple question. What do you not know about your business that you need to know, and how can you find that information from your conversations? And when you ask people that question, they're like, oh, crap. That's a good point. There's all these conversations happening in my business every day, and I don't know. I don't know what I don't know. I don't even know what I don't know, which really plays to the primal fear and what corporate visions calls the lizard brain, the old brain, which is the brain stem in the back of the head where people really make emotional decisions. So yeah, you got to give it up to the Donald. He's appealed to the lizard brain on some mass level.
Amazing stuff. Okay, next one. What motivates you to close more deals?
Being able to hire more salespeople.
And why? And is that just come down to company revenue, long-term forecasts? Because that's it's not a cop out, but that's the simple answer.
Yeah, the simple answer is cash flow.
Why do you need cash flow? What does that mean to you?
Well, I mean, every business needs cash flow, right? And we're growing Exec Vision a little bit more with the bootstrapping route than taking mega investor dollars. And the other big thing that motivates me to close business is I'm so passionate about helping salespeople improve performance. And I know that when our customers implement Exec Vision and literally listen to one of their phone calls per week, one of them, and then break down that one phone call, they will learn so much and get so much better. And we've heard that from customer after customer after customer who has adopted that coaching process, if you will, of listening to one call a week. So because I'm so passionate about that, I'm extremely motivated because I know it will be transformational for these people. Much like a personal trainer at a gym is motivated because they want to see that person lose all that weight. You know, that Jillian lady, she doesn't need to work anymore. She's got plenty of money, but you still see her out there hustling to get people to lose weight because she's so passionate about it.
And I'm going to ask you this, and I don't usually dive this deep into it with guests, but you've been very candid with your responses so far. For you personally, and this puts everything that we talk about on the show, not with you, but with everyone in perspective, what percentage of you, if you could put a number on it, we're both analytical, obviously, from our conversation, so you might be able to go along with this, but what percentage of your motivation day to day comes from money coming in means I can buy that bigger house or a car or whatever it is, versus what you just said then, which is actually seeing a change in someone else or in their business?
Yeah, and I'm going to give you a really, really candid answer. I've been very blessed and fortunate in my career at a young age to have an extremely successful company called Foresight that's produced cash flow where I've been able to live the way I want to live. I'm not a particularly material possession-oriented person. I drive a Mazda Tribute. I would drive a Mazda Tribute if I had $100 million. I really would. I will never buy a Ferrari or whatever. So for me, certainly having some comfort for my kids and paying for their college and things like that. But for me, it's really like 80% the mission of what we're trying to accomplish, and 20% the financial stuff that comes out. And I've heard that from other people. Will, they said if you love what you do and you're passionate about what you do and you reach the top of your game, the money will follow, the prestige and all that kind of stuff will follow. But it's all about finding that thing that you're really passionate about. And actually, that's a good challenge for the folks listening today, for your audience. If you're in a sales role and you're not passionate about the sales role you're in, but you're passionate about sales, go get a different sales job and seriously, get yourself in a role where you're going to be happy selling what you're selling and you believe in what you're selling and you're behind it emotionally.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, Steve. So this is an ongoing trend that I see from people who own multiple businesses or own very large businesses. They may have started off being motivated by what we see on Instagram and Facebook constantly of boats and this and cars and flash clothes and hustle, but then they eventually get to a place where they're happiest when they've got all the basics sorted, I guess, in the hierarchy of needs. But then they've actually got a purpose, and it's all cliche, everything that I'm saying here, but it is a trend I'm noticing, and that's why I'm diving into that question a bit more with the guests, to give the audience a bit more of a feedback and a view from successful people rather than people who are trying to sell you some kind of course or online thing, and they're selling it to you by saying they've got all these material things, which I guess when you are, and if you get to that level of success, which I don't think I'm there yet by any means.
Will, you are my book. Come on, you are my book. Actually, Will, can I jump in real quick with something?
Of course you can.
I believe actions speak louder than words. So one of the ways that I have committed to the community of sales professionals that are out there is we're doing something called the Cull Camp at Exec Vision. And what that means is we break down real sales calls, for what's working and what's not. And we do 3 call camps per month. I'm committing to do them basically monthly. It might end up being every other month when it's done. 1 for sales development reps. Think of those people as prospecting lead qualification. 1 for your hunters, your account executives, your inside sales reps, your territory managers, the people who have to close new business. And then a 3rd one for account managers, customer success, the farmer salespeople who upsell, cross-sell, renew. So again, I'm living my mission, and I'm putting it into action by saying, we're going to do these call camps. They're always going to be free. There's no bait and switch. We're not trying to sell you an online course. And we're going to have awesome celebrity guest coaches on. I already have a running list of the who's who of the people you'd want to listen to your call and coach it. We're going to take real calls from real salespeople, both our customers and not our customers. It doesn't matter to us, and break those down. And we're going to learn a lot. We're going to have a lot of fun doing it. So if you want to check out the call camp, I think you're going to have that in the notes there.
Steve, we'll link to that in the show notes over at salesman.red. What we can potentially do is, so I sell ad space on the website, ad space on the podcast. I do that very specifically so that I'm still in sales and I can experiment with these things. So we're doing a split test at the moment with a number of touch points of social selling and a whole bunch of other cool stuff. So I'm quite regularly on the phone with potential customers. You'll know most of them in the industry who would want to be in front of our audience. But as a something that would probably be interesting to the audience, I'll get something recorded, we'll send it over to you, and perhaps we can do some kind of call camp on one of our calls, get the audience to tune in, and they can see whether I'm absolutely just bullshitting all these podcasts that I'm any good at sales, or they can see hopefully that I'm at least average, if not a bit better, and they can they can be the judge themselves. We'll put some kind of poll together. I think that would be good fun.
That would be a blast. I love it. And there it is. Like let's put our money where our mouth is. And if you're willing to expose yourself, in the first 2 call camps, I had to play, the last call camp, I had to play my own calls. So there's nothing like putting yourself out there and playing your call in front of hundreds and hundreds of people. So that would be great, Will. I'm psyched to do that. And let's figure out who we want your celebrity guest coach to be, who will be sitting here side by side with me or virtually, listening to your call and providing you feedback. We'll always lead with positive, though, right?
Definitely. Well, we can talk about it off there, but perhaps we can do some kind of poll on the blog to get the audience to choose someone, because they'll probably choose someone who will give me an absolute hammering and make me look as silly as possible. So even better. And with that, Steve, I've got one final question. Ask everyone that comes on the show, if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at sales?
Slow down.
And why and how specifically would that benefit you?
One of the tendencies, because I listen to my own calls now religiously, and one tend to hear over again is I'm too wordy. I ask questions and then answer the questions for the prospect as opposed to letting them answer. And all of that is rooted in the fact that my brain is always racing with ideas and I'm thinking faster than I'm speaking. There's actually science to that. There's neuroscience to that. Your brain thinks at like 250 per minute word clip. And right now I'm probably talking at about 140. So my brain is thinking faster than I'm speaking. And if I just get myself to a zen place, then I can communicate more effectively, ask better questions, really more in the moment on sales calls. So for you youngins that are coming up through the ranks and you want to learn a lesson from an old guy like me, just slow down with the sale, take the time to really understand the customer, and you will get much better results long term.
Amazing stuff. It's funny you should say that. My next call, the next podcast that we're recording this afternoon, is with an ex-monk, and we're going to talk about mindfulness, slowing down, and really being there for the customer rather than just rattling through your questions. So expect that episode soon, guys. And with that, Steve, before we wrap up, tell us a little bit about Exec Vision. You mentioned it before, but tell us where we can find out more about it, and then any other links you want to share as well.
Sure, Will. Thanks so much. So execvision.io. And link in with me. Connect with me on LinkedIn. Mention the show when you connect with me on LinkedIn. That will be a good way to make sure you get invited to call camps and things like that as well. And I mentioned it before, we're building the conversation cloud. It will be the world's first conversation cloud that will take what's historically been a very difficult medium. There's this paradox. Well, everyone's got call recording in some capacity, either the phone system, their screen sharing tools like the WebEx, Join Me, Clear Slide, GoToMeeting. But even though they have recording, the paradox is they very rarely do anything with the recordings they have, which would almost be like a sports coach locking the game film in the closet and saying, there it is, but you can't use it. It absolutely makes no sense. So I'm hellbound to solve that problem for sales professionals and really crack some big problems like onboarding and coaching and driving messaging consistency and learning the science of conversations.
Amazing stuff, Steve. And with that, I want to thank you for your candid answers today. I want to thank you for your time, and I want to thank you for joining us on the Salesman Podcast.
Will, thanks so much.
There we have it. I hope you enjoyed the show with Steve Richard. Steve is welcome back on the Salesman Podcast at any point. He's a wealth of knowledge, full of data. And yeah, I just really enjoy chatting to him. And I think hopefully you lot will have got something out of this as well. Remember, join the salesman.red and Salesman Podcast Facebook group over at salesman.red/group. I'll accept people into the group later on in the week, and I'll see you all again in there and on the show tomorrow.